a modelled answer for line graphs, which is, of course, a common piece of visual information that you could see in your Task 1 question. A few of you have been asking for more of these modelled live writing type lessons, and if you do want to see more of certain, then let me know and I will try and update and create new lessons for you. Okay, so let's go back to our checklist. In red at the top, we have our structure and organisation, which, as always, is your paraphrased introduction, the overview, and 2 detailed paragraphs. Of course, we'll need some clear grouping, which we can think about whilst we write our plan. Underneath, we have a few writing features such as our adverb-verb, adjective-noun agreements, and of course mixed openers and a different mix of sentence types to use in our writing. So let's move on to our question. The graph below represents the total exports of clothing from 3 different countries over a time period. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Okay, so let's take a look at the visual information that we have and once again begin with the title. So our title says clothing exports between 1990 to 2003. I'm then going to take a look at the line graph and see if there's a key, which there is. So the 3 countries are Colombia, Japan, and Myanmar. It's worth saying that once you get your question, it's definitely worth looking around the graph or visual information to get a better understanding of the data you've been shown. So back to the key, we've got these 3 countries, Colombia, Japan, and Myanmar, and they are colour-coded onto our line graph above. On the y-axis, we can see millions of dollars from 0 to $1,000 million. And on the x-axis, we have our years from 1990, 2000, 2011, 2012, and 2013. From just taking a quick snap look at this data, the big thing that stands out is Myanmar, which has gone from 0 in 1990 and sprung up all the way to 800 to plus $900 million. That's just taking a very quick glance at the data we've been shown. So once again, we now need to think about creating our plan. Okay, so we need to begin by grouping our data into the 2 groups. Of course, that will correlate with what I describe in each detailed paragraph. So here is the data that we have. I could group by country, although if I was to group Colombia and Japan in group 1 and Myanmar in group 2, that would mean detailed paragraph 2 would only discuss Myanmar. So, to be able to compare in each detailed paragraph, I think it's better to use the dates to give me more idea about what I can compare in each detailed paragraph. So let's go with group 1 as being 1990 to, let's say, 2000. So I will compare, in fact, 2011. And then for group 2, I'm going to go with 2012 to 2013. So in my first detailed paragraph, I will describe all 3 countries between the years of 1990 to 2000 to 2011. And my second group, which will be detailed paragraph 2, will be all 3 countries described again in 2012 and 2013. So let's move on to our overview. And I need to think about a few general statements that I could write about. I think I'm going to split into Colombia and Japan and Myanmar. So that's how I'm going to describe a very general trend for each of those 2. So if I do CJ for Colombia and Japan, and I'm going to say overall no large changes. Although we can see, for example, with Colombia, there is an increase. It's not quite as pronounced as in Myanmar. Japan very much stays the same, fluctuates at round about 550 million. And then we need to say something for Myanmar. So if I just add an M, and then I can say huge fluctuations in exports, because we can see from Myanmar they go to 0 all the way up to 800, then 950, then a huge downturn to 350. So there's a lot more differences in the exports from Myanmar in comparison to the other two countries. So that's my plan. Let's have a quick look. Group 1, 1990 to 2011. Group 2 is 2012 to 2013, so they are my detailed paragraphs. My overview, I'm going to simply say that Colombia and Japan didn't see huge changes in their exports, whereas Myanmar saw very drastic differences between the years in the exports of their clothes. So it's time for me to move on to actually writing this report. And I do feel that I have a good understanding about the information shown to me now. Okay, so let's begin with our paraphrased introduction. So return to the question, the first part of the question. The graph below represents the total exports of clothing from 3 different countries over a time period. So I need to use my understanding of synonyms to paraphrase and rewrite for my report. The line graph, so instead of saying the graph below, the line graph, or I could say the given line graph. The given line graph represents, let's say, shows, instead of represents, the total export of clothing. So that's very similar to what the question has said, but that's okay. We don't need to paraphrase and change everything. From 3 different countries over a time period of 13 years. And once again, I do apologise for the spelling there. So let's read back our introduction paragraph. The given line graph shows the total export of clothing from 3 different countries over a time period of 13 years. So I've paraphrased the question. I've used some different expressions and language, and I'm happy with what I have written there. So let's move on to our overview paragraph. You remember from the plan that the overview I grouped Colombia and Japan together and stated there weren't huge differences, especially not in comparison to Myanmar. I also mentioned in my plan that Myanmar saw huge fluctuations in their total exports of clothes. So let's begin. And of course, as always, overall, we can see that Colombia and Japan didn't see such huge fluctuations in comparison to Myanmar. So that very simply just gives an overall idea of the data that's been shown, and I've managed to do it in one sentence. Overall, we can see that Colombia and Japan didn't see such huge fluctuations in comparison to Myanmar. And let's say what the fluctuations are. Didn't see such huge fluctuations in clothing exports in comparison to Myanmar. Let's say whose figures changed drastically over the time period. Let's have one more read through. Overall, we can see that Colombia and Japan didn't see such huge fluctuations in clothing exports in comparison to Myanmar, whose figures changed drastically over the time period. So I think that gives a really nice overview of the visual information that we have. It's also important to note that I haven't included any specific figures in the overview, which you shouldn't do. We save that for the detail paragraphs, which I'm going to move on to now. So from the plan, you remember that I grouped Group 1 as 1990, 2000 and 2011. So in my first detailed paragraph, I'll be explaining and describing the data from the three countries over these first 3 years. So let's begin with, in 1990, Colombia and Japan had similar exports at around, let's say, 450 to $570 million in that year. On the other hand, a really good mixed opener that we can start with. On the other hand, Myanmar had 0 sales of clothing. So I'm using sales because I think I'm using exports too much. Myanmar had 0 sales of clothing. Had no sales of clothing at all. On the other hand, Myanmar had no sales of clothing at all. In the next 10 years to 2000, Myanmar's figure rose. Apologies for my writing there. Myanmar's figure rose drastically to $800 million. Let's say from Colombia and Japan, which are very similar, around 520. Let's say to $800 million, over 250 million more than both Japan and Colombia. Okay, let's have a quick read through. So we've done the first 2 years. I also need to describe 2011. In 1990, Colombia and Japan had similar exports at around 450 to $570 million. On the other hand, Myanmar had no sales of clothing at all. So that's 1990 done. In the next 10 years, so this is why it's important to read your writing back. In the next 10 years to 2000, Myanmar's figure rose drastically. So I'm using these different features of language. In the next 10 years to 2000, Myanmar's figure rose drastically to $800 million, over 250 more than both Japan and Colombia. And what do we see onto 2011? So we can see that all countries saw some increase into 2011. So let's keep it simple and just write that. Onto 2011, let's not start with onto. All countries saw an increase. All countries saw an increase in export in 2011. So I'm not being too specific there. I'm just saying that all the countries had some kind of increase. I think I've wrote quite a lot for my first detailed paragraph. I could say that Myanmar was still the highest. All countries saw an increase in exports in 2011, with Myanmar still the highest in total sales, I'm going to say, instead of exports. So that's my first 3 years done. I'm now going to move on to describe 2012 to 2013. So there is actually quite a big change between these 2 years of 2011 and 2012, and that is that Myanmar's figure shoots all the way down to become the lowest once again, and actually almost half, or pretty much exactly half, of what Colombia is producing in clothing that year. So Myanmar's at around $350 million, whereas Colombia is at 700. So that's probably something that I can use using this language of halves and quarters or whatever you need to do for your report. It shows the examiner a different understanding of the language. So let's move on to detail paragraph 2. Let's begin with Myanmar saw a massive downturn in clothing production, in clothing export, let's say, in 2012, falling to around $350 million. Half of Colombia's total sales, which sat at $700 million. And let's describe Japan in this year. So Japan decreased slightly to around, let's say, $560 million, to around $560 million. So I've described all the information about 2012. Let's move on to 2013. Now, we can see that both Colombia and Japan see steady decreases, whereas Myanmar actually has another fluctuation, and Myanmar sees an increase. So we can describe this. Let's say by 2013, both Colombia and Japan continued to see a decrease in exports, whereas, another way to say on the other hand, whereas Myanmar saw a slight increase, although was still the lowest producer or exporter of clothes in 2013. Okay, I could go on to maybe describe, that Colombia was the highest in the end and Japan was second and give some more figures. But to be honest, I think I've gone into quite enough detail and I've described lots of the main data. So let's have a quick read through once more. Okay, so from the start, from my paraphrased introduction, and I can see from my checklist paraphrased introduction, yes, overview, yes, detailed paragraphs 2, yes. So I know that I've structured this in the right way. Clear grouping, this is my data, how I've grouped and described my data here. So I know the examiner is going to find this quite easy to follow. So let's read through. The given line graph shows the total export of clothing from 3 different countries over a time period of 13 years. Overall, we can see that Colombia and Japan didn't see such huge fluctuations in clothing exports in comparison to Myanmar, whose figures changed drastically over the time period. So I've got some interesting vocabulary here to describe the trends in the visual information. In 1990, Colombia and Japan had similar exports at around $450 to $570 million in that year. So I'm comparing these two countries and saying it's quite similar. There is some difference. On the other hand, Myanmar had no sales of clothing at all. In the next 10 years to 2000, Myanmar's figure rose drastically to $800 million. So I'm moving on to this year now. Rose drastically to $800 million, over 250 more than both Japan and Colombia. So comparing again, making comparisons. All countries saw an increase. I need to just get rid of that. All countries saw an increase in exports in 2011. With Myanmar still the highest in sales, still the highest in total sales. So Myanmar is very high in 2011 for their exports. In fact, the highest on the whole line graph. That's something you could even mention, but I have chosen not to. Okay, Myanmar saw a massive downturn in clothing exports in 2012, falling to around $350 million. Over half, you could say. Half of Colombia's total sales, which sat at $700 million, so comparing this part of the data. Japan decreased slightly to around $560 million, so there's a slight decrease here. By 2013, both Colombia and Japan continued to see a decrease in exports, whereas Myanmar saw a slight increase, although was still the lowest exporter of clothes in 2013. So that rounds up this Task 1 report for line graphs. I feel that I have definitely included lots of information, specific information about this visual information. And I know that my features checklist is well covered. So the organisation is there, it's easy to read, and I've got lots of specific information with some good language such as whereas and although and different kinds of things in here. So I'm pretty happy with this Task 1 report. See you in the next lesson.